I was just kind of scanning images online, and just as they passed over, I was getting confused. Is this an art image? Is this an advertisement? I'm having a hard time telling the difference between the two. When I graduated from college, I began working for a commercial photographer in New York, somebody named Hashi, and his specialty was liquids and ice. And we did primarily product photography, and he was well known for this sort of moving still life, shots where ice was falling into the water and the water was exploding out. After graduate school, I also worked for a commercial photographer in Cincinnati, and we also did product shots there, worked on images for circulars for department stores. I've studied art history and then have this background in commercial photography, and I studied photo history. But I've always been interested in this relationship between commercial and fine art, and how in photography specifically, it has been fraught, really from its earliest days of photography trying desperately to be understood as a fine art, the possibilities for it being a fine art, and then it being taken up by advertising in the early part of the 20th century, being so useful for advertising because of this idea that we have that photography renders things truthfully, and so you can well show a product that you might want to encourage other people to buy. And then sort of in the 70s, still this idea of what fine art photography was. Really a small 8x10 black and white photograph on the wall, and kind of agitating at that point to be understood as it could be something else. This show really looks at the way that artists borrowed from, looked over to, anticipated commercial practices. Chronologically, there was kind of an early movement towards critiquing advertising and pulling it out and breaking it apart and really trying to show us what was happening. And then as the years progressed, it seems as if artists were less engaged in that critique and interested in subsuming it and borrowing what it could do for the purpose of their own art production. I think it has a lot to do with this shift from physical appropriation, cutting out magazines, re-photographing them, representing them, to the appropriation of the process by which advertising photography is made. So in this room, there's the work of David Buchan. He's working in Toronto in the late 1970s. Through these images, he's making fake advertisements. He's staging these images, and then he's writing the copy. And he's riffing off of what an advertisement might be and what it looks like in a different form. But it's set up in a very similar way as we understand an advertisement to be set up. It's an image, and then it tells you something about the image. And these two things work off of each other to kind of push you towards some kind of action. Later, in say the work of Lucas Blaylock, he's not making an advertisement the way that David Buchan is, but he's created this image that is sort of, a still life, but also a product shot, and then doing all these other different things simultaneously. I think artists who are working now, they often talk about this slippage between their work life. Let's say they're working from home on a computer where they use Photoshop to touch up commercial images. And then 5 o'clock comes, and then they switch over. They're at the same computer, at their same desk, making their art image.
My general tendency as an artist would be to fill out instrumentality in general. I'm much more interested in intellectual histories and natural histories in themselves. So it can usually be quite difficult for me to wrap things up in a timely manner or to otherwise efficiently represent something in one image or a sequence of images. So generally, various commercial techniques at a very practical level, their time frames and their timelines, have been really helpful as an external stimulus, what Anna Freud would have called identification with the aggressor. I've learned how to do the thing that I don't want to do. Freedom for me comes in the artwork in a few places. One, I think, has to do with the possibility that the meaning of the image isn't one thing. Allegorical resonance is possible in an artwork in a way that's not possible in an advertisement. The advertisement, in the end, even if it transmits a vibe, is in the service of selling Nikes or, if not shoes, some other product. So within my work, there is this interest in technical precision and precision in image making. There's also the promise of new technologies, of images that have not yet been made, which in some ways isn't an intellectual practice for advertising. This is a market impulse. And I suppose there's some relationship of that to something like an historical avant-garde, to push a form past where it's been. So in some sense, there's a non-antagonistic relationship between those two forces.
One of the things that's interesting about advertising is it points you outside the frame. It says, look at this bottle of whiskey, look at this cigarette, please buy, look at this dress, please purchase this. Whereas art photography is asking you to look inside the frame, look at this art object. Rather than having your consumption sought out outside, it says, hey, come and be taken, desire this object of art.
I would say the biggest thing that I have noticed is the difference between speaker and viewer in both advertising and art. And that difference is quite stark because as an art director, my voice is not my own. I am speaking for something or someone else. No one knows who I am. It's sort of an underdetermined or absent speaker, but the audience are completely overdetermined. Their demographics, and they're researched and marketed to as a sort of slice of the population. So the underdetermined speaker and the overdetermined audience in advertising in that landscape versus making art as an artist, as a speaker, it's completely overdetermined. And the audience or the viewers are left in a sort of big question mark. I first noticed these books literally for selling shelves in a furniture store. So they were there to make the shelves look good. They are used as props in a lot of theater productions, trade fairs, furniture stores, staging for interior decorators, that kind of a thing. The relationship between sort of an anonymous speaker and its audience, I think, is manifested in these books. When I first found them in a furniture store in London, they caught my eye in terms of the absurdity of their titles or the blankness of the titles. Not only are they blank books, but the titles are very, very generic and kind of confusingly so. That anonymity of these books, and there are no authors printed on the spines of the books, really came to fruition in the film Hawaii 23 that I made because I went and found the factory where the books are made. And in fact, these were not generated via algorithm, but written by Thomas Moser, who owned the factory. And then I ended up photographing them because they are already presenting themselves to be two-dimensional images. They're all front. I found them charming, well-designed, mysterious, interesting. I don't denigrate them in any way. I'm very attached to them. I do start with a place of critique, but you have to love something to want to engage with it. And so there is this kind of push and pull in that regard. And then my project in general, I think across my practice, is to look closely and look longer, hence making these background items foreground.
I love Jackson Pollock. I love 1950 Jackson Pollock. I went to the Met in 2004 with headphones on a Saturday night and tripped out in front of the Autumn Rhythm painting that they have. I love the work. I've always been really aware of the way that culture actually functions. Coming from just a more sort of flat-footed sensibility, it always seemed that culture is always entirely in service of something else besides itself. And perhaps that's where it gets interesting, right? Is like perhaps that intersection is actually what is meaningful. The images in the work, the kind of minor images, are the little pasted on photos. It's Vogue, March of 1951. It's well storied in art history. And it's not just Jackson Pollock's painting being subjugated to a shoot by Cecil Beaton. It's art directed by Alexander Lieberman for Vogue. There's a larger technical and cultural process in which culture is actually constructed. And it's not just the failure of the modernist dream. It's in fact a material process in which you have the publishing industry in New York and the very kind of naive young fashion business in New York and photographers that trafficked, in and out of museums and magazines and books like Cecil Beaton, somehow working together in a collaborative space to somehow create something of cultural significance, right? And the kind of set of images that I look in is much broader than just art history. And so a lot of times those slippages, convergences, and divergences between different segments of production, whether it's the movie business, the myth of Jackson Pollock, Vogue, fine art, the museum, the circulation space, all those kind of different spaces, that's always very generative space for me as an artist.
There are two works in the exhibition that are advertisements. One is the earliest piece in the show, which is by John Outerbridge from 1936, called Christmas Gifts, and it was reproduced in House Beautiful. I chose to include it because he was an exquisite color printer. This process that he used, the Carbro print, he absolutely mastered it, and he used it for commercial enterprises. It was really expensive. They could afford to pay him to do it, but he also used it for his own personal work as well. So he did balance those two worlds. So in that same room, there is a work by Roe Etheridge that he made for Celine. It is an advertisement for this bracelet. We acquired the work here at LACMA for the collection. So it is an advertising image, but Roe works kind of in both worlds so readily that his commercial art is his fine art, his fine art is his commercial art. They both do very similar things, which is to present this thing and then change it a little bit, make it a little bit weird, make it a little bit uncomfortable. You have this image of this bracelet next to these fake grapes with fake leaves, and then a cup that has a lipstick mark on it, and then a Bic lighter. So you might say, oh, beautiful bracelet, but then you start to look at the surround and it's almost like it turns in another direction. And so these realms blur, and they're using the same kind of strategies and the same ideas. And it's absolutely acceptable as well. We don't have these structures up anymore that says this is art, and this is an advertisement, and this is commercial art, and this is fine art. I think we've abolished those, and I think this show shows us that.